What if I told you that the debate between kitsch and avant-garde art isn't just about taste, but about power, accessibility, and class? Let's dive into the history, arguments, and why this debate matters now more than ever. This video was inspired by a comment left on last week's video about nostalgia. Somebody talked about Odd Niram's work on kitsch that was written, I believe, in 2001, and I revisited it because I know I read part of it in college, and wow, yeah, it's definitely incredibly applicable, so I'm excited to jump in. And I'm excited to talk about this as someone who's thought about this a lot and someone who makes artwork sort of in this camp kitsch arena. But first...
This is what you missed last week on Shameless.
All you're missing is the initial redraw phase. I drew some lines and back to it. First, let's start out with some definition. Kitsch is defined as art or an object that's considered to be in poor taste because of their overly sentimental, mass-produced, or simplistic nature. Kitsch is often created to appeal to a broad, popular taste rather than to push artistic boundaries and to provoke deep intellectual conversations. Some examples of this that might resonate with y'all is like Lisa Frank art or Hallmark movies or even sort of overly Pinteresty looking themes. I also think of the word cheugy as something that often sort of has overlap with kitsch. And the reason I think cheugy is an apt word to sort of bring up is because I also want to draw a difference between camp, which kitsch is really defined as like an earnest, like I like this because I like it, where camp sort of is tongue-in-cheek. It's a bit of a wink and an understanding that I can see that this is kitsch and I like it, but that awareness gives it that little bit of separation between camp and kitsch. Avant-garde hand refers to experimental or unorthodox art that pushes boundaries and challenges traditional norms. Avant-garde artists often seek to provoke, disrupt, or challenge the viewer's perceptions, and their work is typically associated with cutting-edge ideas and techniques. I think of this as the overly used phrase, in my personal opinion, of art should disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed. Before I rattle off some examples of avant-garde art and culture, I want to put a spotlight on the fact that I was like literally sweating as I was finding good examples, because everything that the web sort of defined as avant-garde art, I know people who sort of think that it's too plebeian, too commonplace, too many people know about it for it to be considered true avant-garde art. And there's this sort of idea that runs through a lot of countercultures where if anyone knows about it, it's no longer cool or meaningful or pushes boundaries. So a little bit case in point, but anyways. The Infinity Rooms by the artist Yayoi Kusama is considered to be avant-garde art. Jenny Holzer's truism, so her use of LED sort of text-based art and a lot of like really evocative language is thought to be sort of boundary pushing. Riot Girl Zines has also been described as avant-garde because it's sort of meant to be punky and a challenge to patriarchy and normal aesthetic norms, especially for women. And that last point is a great segue into a little bit of the historical context, because as much as I sort of think avant-garde art, as opposed to kitsch in particular, is very snobbish, elitist, and I personally make stabs at that within the context of my own work as an artist, I will say, like, in the broader idea of things, I'm grateful for avant-garde art to exist. And I think that the best feature of avant-garde art is the idea that it's pushing up against sort of broader cultural norms. For a tiny bit of history, at least within the Western canon of art, and more specifically within the context of painting used to be tied to documentation. Basically, a painting was as much about artistry and skill as it was sort of making sure that the masses, or people who encountered the art at the very least, understood what was being painted. So whether it was painting pictures of royals or historical moments or biblical stories, there was this real need for art to sort of have this technical ability because it was trying to show realism in order to create narratives. And with the adoption of the camera as a documentation tool, painting in particular has a bit of an identity crisis. And we see this manifest first with the Impressionists and then Cubists and Fauvists, and art becomes less and less perfectly representational, focusing more on the experience of the artist, the sort of internal experiences happening, all the way until we get through abstract expressionism, and Duchamp goes and buys a urinal from basically Home Depot, puts it on a white pedestal and says it's art because the artist says it's art. And we've achieved, I think, pinnacle avant-garde, at least within the Western canon in the 20th century. Of course, if you throw in Clement Greenberg's 1939 essay Avant-Garde and Kitsch, where he fully draws the battle lines, so to speak, and really prioritizes avant-garde and the understanding of context over sort of the low-hanging fruit, overly sentimental mass culture that is kitsch, we really see a similar conversation that we're contending with today. And before I really dive into why I personally am such such an advocate for kitsch, I will say sort of the one thing that I think is really powerful about avant garde is the idea that there should be space for art that isn't, quote, for you. I think of the SNL skit, Wishing Well for Sensitive Boys, and there's a part where Emma Stone, who's the mom, turns to the other little boys who are playing like baseball and says, this isn't for you, it's for sensitive boys. And I think that as funny as that is, like, it really speaks to the idea that I think avant garde at its best sort of shields itself from having to endear itself to the masses, which I think to a lot of marginalized identities and really niche expressions can be unsafe and even at worst violent. So I would never advocate that art has to appeal to the masses or has to be sentimental or has to have narrative built in. I think there's space for great conversations that can only be had in really avant-garde, niche, contextual spaces. But how did we go from avant-garde being a statement of freedom and allowing people to paint whatever they wanted without it needing to appeal to the masses to basically the exact opposite? Whereas nowadays and in more recent history, if your artwork on some level appeals to the masses or appears to be kitsch in any way, it's inherently an inferior type of art. Well, we have to start all the way back in the Cold War era to get a better understanding of how, I'm going to give you the Spark Notes version of how the CIA funded abstract art, but just know I'm leaving out a lot of things. It hurts me. The teacher inside of me wishes I could talk about this for 2 hours straight. And also the being a woman on the internet for 10 plus years knows that people are going to pick apart all the things I left out. I know this is a deeper conversation, but for the sake of brevity, during the like the USSR and China really invested in realist artists for a couple of reasons. One, because having technical ability is like this one little aspect of art, which is otherwise incredibly subjective, that you can measure to somewhat objectively. And what I mean by that is like you can tell if someone has technical skill in a way that sort of kind of mimics like talent in like a sportsy kind of way. Like whether or not you get the art, you like the art, you can sort of acknowledge when someone is a very skilled painter of representational life. And then the other reason that realism was really shining in these countries is because the artwork could be a display of skill and aptitude and feed into this Cold War era pissing contest between nations and also speak to the masses, which was another big part of these movements. For good or for bad, there was a real focus on sort of uplifting and having conversation and bringing power to the worker, the peasant, the everyday person. And the US, on the other hand, had this organic movement of painters who were sort of tearing at the seams of representational realism. The funny thing about this is in the very beginning, a lot of US senators who were sort of these war hawk isolationists accused this form of artwork, this abstract art, as being communist. It was sort of a just pejorative for anything they didn't like and didn't understand. But there was a CIA operative who actually worked at the Guggenheim who chose to actually put a tremendous amount of money behind these artists as a way to showcase a form of soft power. Basically, they said, yeah, we're different than the Soviet countries. We aren't even doing realism. We're pushing the frontier. We're leaning into freedom. So the CIA basically just put a bunch of money behind the artwork. They also paid for these shows that would travel all around the world. And for me, it's really the beginning of this sort of formal, if you don't get it, you're just not in the end. The art is important because we say it's important form of elitism that I do criticize. The most relevant part of the CIA funding the abstract expressionist movement is that it was the first real pillar of who America saw itself in regards to fine art. Prior to the mid-20th century, the US really took its cues from Europe, but after this, America really had its own art identity, and it was anchored to this expressive, innovative form of art that prioritized being different and avant-garde at the cost of everything else. So in addition to this idea of freedom, at least this like nebulous American capitalist idea of freedom, we also have the ideals of individuality as well as rigorous intellectualism. And this is where the story begins to butt into my own personal life and lived experience, especially this idea of sort of preferring this intellectual, this white collar type work that prefers sort of the investor class over the labor class. And I grew up with my parents sort of warning me of the perils of working with your body over working with your mind, and they really drilled in me the importance of college, especially because my parents both suffered disabilities at the hands of their hard physical labor job. And ideas that might seem initially like they belong in the purview of OSHA and workers' comp regulations really echo out into the conversation around kitsch versus avant-garde, things that endear themselves to the masses and have more to do with the physical skill and labor that goes into artwork. But for me, I see a shining light at the end of the tunnel, ironically, and of all things, AI. I think AI really shows us a future that we don't want, this sort of extreme pendulum swing away from valuing these humanist sentiment and mass-focused values, that things don't have to appeal to the masses to be valuable, but they also don't have to run away from the human experience experience of making and enjoying art. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a comment below, like and subscribe. I always appreciate y'all's opinions, and I'll talk to you guys next week in the following video.